On the 19th of August, 43 BC, the most powerful man in Rome was 19 years old. He had marched 8 legions on the city and demanded the consulship, in a state where the law said a consul had to be past 40. To understand how a teenager ended up in that position, and what he did with the next 57 years of it, you first have to see how much world there was to take. By the year he died, the empire that boy had built reached from the Atlantic surf on the coast of Portugal to the upper Euphrates, and from the cold gray water of the North Sea to the edge of the Sahara. Measured east to west, it ran something close to 4,000 kilometers, north to south, roughly 3,000. Call it 4.5 million square kilometers of land and sea, with the Mediterranean sitting in the middle of it like a private lake. The only large body of water in human history to have been entirely enclosed by a single state. Between 45 and 60 million people lived inside those borders, which is to say that somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 6 human beings then alive answered in the end to one man. 25 legions held the edges, strung out along 3 rivers and a desert: the Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates. Behind them lay a network of paved roads with stone markers every Roman mile, and at the center of that network, in the Forum at Rome, stood a gilded column listing the distances to the great cities of the world. He governed it for 44 years, from the sea fight at Actium to the morning he died in a small town in Campania, which was the longest period of one-man rule Rome had ever known. The city he governed it from had grown to 1 million people, the largest city on earth, and it would not be matched anywhere in Europe for another 17 centuries, and his name outlasted all of it. Every Roman emperor who followed him, for 1,500 years, in Rome and then in Constantinople, took the word Augustus as part of his title, and the word Caesar as part of his name. And from that word, worn down by time and other languages, came Kaiser in Germany and Tsar in Russia. He was born a boy from a small hill town whose family nobody in the Senate had heard of. You are going to see the will read aloud in Rome that made a teenager the heir of the most powerful man in the world, and the comet that ordinary Romans took for a dead man climbing into heaven. You will see the lists posted in the Forum naming men to be killed and the price for killing them. You will stand in the marsh at Philippi where the Roman Republic died with Brutus, and in the harbor a childhood friend cut through a hillside to build a navy from nothing. You will watch a queen's 60 ships hoist sail at Actium and run for open water, and you will hear the argument, still unsettled, about what she was actually doing. You will see the morning the Senate was handed back the Roman world and gave it straight back, wrapped in a new name. You will see what the peace looked like from underneath, in pots and coins and shipwrecks and the tombstones of freed slaves. And you will go into a forest in Germany, where 3 legions walked in and did not come out, and where the Roman Empire stopped growing forever. Before we go on, if you want more long-form history like this, hit the like button and subscribe, because it genuinely does decide whether these get made. And while you watch, think about this one, because we want it in the comments. Was Augustus the man who saved the Roman world from tearing itself to pieces, or the man who murdered the Roman Republic and was clever enough to be thanked for it? Pick a side and tell us why. Why did Julius Caesar leave everything to a 19-year-old nobody? That is the first question, and the answer explains almost everything that follows. The boy was born Gaius Octavius on the 23rd of September, 63 BC, in a house near the Palatine in Rome, and his family came from Velitrae, a hill town, about 35 kilometers southeast of the city. They were rich. They were not noble. His grandfather had been a moneylender by one hostile account, and a local magistrate by a kinder one, and his father was the first of the line to reach the Senate. That father died when the boy was 4. What the family did have was one connection that mattered more than any amount of money. His mother, Atia, was the daughter of Julius Caesar's sister. The boy was Caesar's great-nephew, and Caesar had no living legitimate son. Caesar noticed him. He gave the boy a place in his African triumph in 46 BC, even though he had not fought there, and the following year he sent for him to join the Spanish campaign. The boy fell ill, missed the sailing, then traveled anyway, was shipwrecked, and crossed hostile country with a handful of companions to reach his great-uncle's camp. Caesar was impressed. In the winter of 45 BC, he sent him across the Adriatic to Apollonia, a Greek city on the coast of what is now Albania, to study rhetoric and to learn the army from the inside. Because 6 legions were quartered nearby waiting for the great Parthian war Caesar meant to launch in the spring. The boy was 18. He was thin, often sick, with bad teeth and a weak chest, and by every description unimpressive in a world that took physical presence very seriously. On the 15th of March, 44 BC, Caesar was stabbed to death in a hall attached to the theater of Pompey by roughly 60 senators. The news took days to cross the sea. When it reached Apollonia, the officers around the boy offered to march the legions to Italy and put him at their head. He refused, which was the first sign of the thing that would define him. He crossed with a few friends, landed quietly near Brundisium, and only then learned the rest. Caesar's will had been opened and read in Rome. 3/4 of a very large estate went to the boy from Velitrae. And, in the last line that mattered, Caesar adopted him. Under Roman practice, that meant he ceased to be Gaius Octavius and became Gaius Julius Caesar. Historians call him Octavian for clarity. He never once used that name himself. From the moment he stepped ashore, he insisted on being called Caesar, and he was right to, because the name was the inheritance. The money was secondary. Why did Caesar do it? There were older, more obvious men available. Mark Antony was his surviving consular colleague, a soldier of real ability who had commanded the left wing at Pharsalus. Decimus Brutus, one of the assassins, was actually named in the will as a substitute heir. The likeliest answer is the least romantic one. Roman adoption in a will was about a name and a family line, not about succession to a state, because Rome had no such thing. Caesar was 55, planning a campaign in the east that would keep him away for 3 years, and he needed a legal heir. He picked the closest male relative of the right blood, who had shown he was not a fool. What Caesar cannot have foreseen is what the name would be worth in the hands of a young man willing to use it without any of the restraint an older man would have felt. His mother and stepfather told him to refuse the inheritance. Every experienced person around him told him to refuse it. Accepting meant accepting a blood feud with the men who had killed Caesar at 18, with no army, no office, no standing, and no legal capacity to hold any command for another 20 years. He accepted. Then he did something nobody expected. Antony was sitting on Caesar's papers and Caesar's money and had no intention of handing over either. So the boy sold property, borrowed heavily, and paid Caesar's legacy to the people of Rome out of his own pocket. Caesar had left 300 sesterces to every citizen, roughly a third of a year's pay for a common laborer. 250,000 men queued up and took the money and were told exactly whose son had paid it. Then, the sky helped him. In July of 44 BC, he staged the games that Caesar had founded in honor of the family's divine ancestor. And during those games, a comet appeared and stayed visible for 7 nights, bright enough to be seen in the hour before sunset. Astronomers in China recorded a comet in the same period, so the object was real. In Rome, ordinary people looked up and decided they were watching the soul of the murdered dictator being received among the gods. The young heir did nothing to discourage them. He put the star on his coins. He put a star on the statue of Caesar. Decades later, he admitted privately, according to a memoir he wrote, and Pliny the Elder read, that he had taken the comet as a sign meant for himself. That is the difference between him and every rival he ever faced. He understood that in Rome, belief was a weapon, and it was cheaper than legions. Now the map begins to move, because in the autumn of 44 BC, the young Caesar went to Campania and did something completely illegal. He walked into the veteran colonies, where Caesar's discharged soldiers had been settled, around Casilinum and Calatia, and he offered every man who would follow him 2,000 sesterces on the spot. 10,000 of them came. He was a private citizen with no command and no office at the head of a private army, and he marched it north to Rome in November, then withdrew when the city refused to rise for him, then went north again into Etruria. Meanwhile, 2 of Antony's own legions, the 4th and the Martian, marching down the Adriatic coast road, changed sides at Alba Fusens and joined the boy instead, largely because he offered more money. Antony went north to take the province of Cisalpine Gaul by force from Decimus Brutus, who shut himself inside the fortress city of Mutina, modern Modena, and waited. In Rome, the Senate had to choose. The man who chose loudest was Marcus Tullius Cicero, 62 years old, the finest speaker in the Latin world, who hated Antony with a personal, career-ending intensity. In a series of speeches he called the Philippics, Cicero argued that the Senate should legalize the boy, arm him, and use him against Antony. He got his way. In January of 43 BC, the Senate granted the 19-year-old the rank of a senator, the right to stand for office 20 years early, and a formal command alongside the two consuls of the year, Hirtius and Pansa. Cicero was reported to have said in private that the young man should be praised, decorated, and lifted up, a phrase which in Latin also carried the sense of lifted out of the way. The remark was repeated back to Antony's friends, and eventually to the young man himself. He remembered it. The relief of Mutina in April of 43 BC was not one battle but two, fought a week apart in flooded ground west of the city. At Forum Gallorum, Antony ambushed the Martian legion in the marshes beside the Emilian Way and mauled it, and the consul Pansa was carried off the field with a wound that killed him days later. At Mutina itself, the consul Hirtius broke into Antony's camp and was killed inside it. Antony retreated over the Alps with his cavalry intact. And when the smoke cleared, both consuls of the Roman Republic were dead within a fortnight. Their armies were standing in the field with no commander, and the only man of rank on the scene was a 19-year-old carrying the name Caesar. Hostile writers later said he had arranged it. There is no evidence he did, and there did not need to be. He simply took the legions. The Senate, having got what it wanted, tried to discard him. It gave the honors to Decimus Brutus, one of the assassins, and voted the boy nothing. So he sent a delegation of centurions to Rome to demand the consulship for him. When the Senate refused, one of the centurions is said to have pushed back his cloak, put his hand on his sword hilt, and said that if the Senate would not give it, this would. So, 8 legions crossed the Rubicon and marched on Rome. There was no fighting. That is the 19th of August we opened on, 4 weeks short of his 20th birthday, and it made him the youngest consul in the history of the Roman Republic by more than 20 years. His first acts in office were to have his adoption formally ratified and to create a special court to try the murderers of his father. Every assassin was condemned in a single afternoon, in their absence, and outlawed. Then he changed sides. That autumn, on a small island in a river near Bononia, modern Bologna, with guards posted on the bridges at both ends, and each man searched for weapons. The young Caesar met Mark Antony and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, the third Caesarian general, who held Spain and Narbonese Gaul. They talked for 2 days. What they agreed was ratified in Rome on the 27th of November, 43 BC, and it was not an alliance, but a legal instrument. The 3 of them became a board of 3 for the ordering of the state, with power to make law, appoint magistrates, and override any other authority for 5 years. It is called the Second Triumvirate. Unlike the informal arrangement between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus a generation earlier, this one was voted, written down, and absolute. Rome had legally suspended itself. Their first joint act was murder as an accounting exercise. They needed money for 45 legions, and they needed their enemies dead, and the proscriptions solved both at once. Lists of names went up in the forum. Any man on the list could be killed by anyone. His property went to the state, and the killer took a reward, with a smaller reward for slaves who informed on their masters. Appian, an Alexandrian lawyer writing in Greek about a century and a half later from good sources, says 300 senators and 2,000 men of the equestrian order were listed. Other traditions give lower numbers. What is not in doubt is that all 3 men gave up relatives to it. Lepidus surrendered his brother, Antony surrendered an uncle, and the young Caesar surrendered Cicero, who had made him, after resisting for 2 days and then agreeing. Cicero was caught near Formiae on the 7th of December, 43 BC, being carried in a litter towards a ship. He put his head out and told them to get it over with. His head and his hands, the hands that had written the speeches, were brought back to Rome and nailed to the speaker's platform in the forum where he had spent 30 years talking, and Romans walked past it every day. The message was not subtle, and it was not meant to be. It said that speech had stopped being a form of power. That was, in a real sense, the moment the Republic ended, 466 years after it began, and the boy who let it happen was 20 years old. How did Octavian defeat the men who killed Caesar? He did it in northern Greece, in the autumn of 42 BC, on a coastal plain that funnels every army in the region into one road. Brutus and Cassius had spent 2 years stripping the eastern provinces of money and men, and they had built something formidable, 19 legions, and a large force of eastern cavalry and archers, and they had the sea. They chose their ground with great skill. West of the town of Philippi, the Egnatian Way, the great Roman highway running from the Adriatic to Byzantium, squeezes through a gap between steep hills to the north and an impassable marsh to the south. Brutus put his camp against the hills. Cassius put his camp against the marsh. They joined the two camps with a fortified wall across the gap, sat down on top of their supply line from the sea, and waited for the triumvirs to starve. Antony and the young Caesar came east with about the same number of legions and almost no supplies because Republican admirals controlled the sea lanes behind them. They had to fight quickly or die of hunger, and there was no way through. So Antony did the one thing the terrain was supposed to prevent. For 10 days, his men worked in the reeds south of the road, cutting a causeway through the marsh under cover of the tall growth, laying fascines and earth, pushing a road into ground everyone had written off. They built it far enough to plant a fort in the marsh, behind Cassius's left flank. On the 3rd of October, Cassius saw what had been done and sent a force to cut the causeway, and the two armies fell into a general engagement that neither commander had planned. What followed was 2 battles happening at once on the same field, with neither side able to see the other half. On the northern flank, Brutus's legions went forward without waiting for orders, smashed the young Caesar's line, and took his camp, killing everyone they found in it. He was not there. He was sick, and by his own later account he had been carried out of the camp that morning because his physician Artorius had dreamt a warning. Hostile writers said he was found hiding in a marsh. On the southern flank, at the same hour, Antony broke through the fortifications, drove Cassius's legions back, and stormed his camp. Cassius, on a hill in dust and confusion, could see his own camp taken and could not see that Brutus had won. He assumed the whole army was destroyed. He went into a tent with a freedman named Pindarus, uncovered his neck, and had the man kill him. He was the better soldier of the two. He died because of a gap in his line of sight. For 3 weeks, the two armies sat facing each other. Brutus wanted to keep waiting because time was on his side, and the triumvir's supply situation was getting worse, but his officers and men pressed him to fight, and on the 23rd of October he came out. The second battle at Philippi was not clever. It was 2 lines of Roman legionaries pushing at close range for hours in near silence, shield against shield, until Brutus's left gave way under Antony, and the whole line rolled up. Appian, describing it from earlier accounts, notes that the men fought without the usual shouting because they knew exactly who they were killing. Brutus got away into the hills with 4 legions, found no support, and asked a friend to hold a sword for him. The last men in the field who believed in the Republic as a functioning thing died in that plain or killed themselves within the week, and the Roman world was left in the hands of 3 warlords, one of whom was 21 years old. The map now divides. In the settlement after Philippi, Antony took the east, everything from Greece to the Euphrates, with the money and the glory of the coming Parthian war. Lepidus was pushed to Africa, then increasingly to nothing, and the young Caesar took Italy, which sounds like the prize, and was in fact the poisoned portion, because Italy was where the bill came due. Somewhere between 40 and 50,000 veterans had to be given farms, and there was no unoccupied land in Italy. So 18 prosperous Italian cities were marked for confiscation, and men who had farmed the same ground for generations were told to get off it. The poet Virgil, a Mantuan whose own district was affected, wrote his first published poems about exactly this. One shepherd lying under a beech tree, with his position secure, while another drives his goats away from land he will never see again. That is a contemporary witness, and the bitterness in it is not literary. The dispossessed had a champion. Antony's wife, Fulvia, one of the toughest political operators of the age, and Antony's brother Lucius, then consul, made themselves the leaders of the Italians against the young Caesar. raised troops, and seized Rome. Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, the young Caesar's friend from school and by far the best soldier he would ever have, drove them into the hill city of Perusia, modern Perusia, and built a wall of trenches and forts right around it. Through the winter of 41 BC, the city starved. And here, archaeology speaks with a very human voice, because the lead sling bullets fired over those walls have been dug up in quantity, and both sides wrote on them before firing. Some carry unit names. Many carry obscenities so crude and so specific, aimed at Fulvia and at the young Caesar personally, that they are still difficult to translate on a family channel. Perusia surrendered in February of 40 BC and burned. Antony came back to Italy that year with a fleet, and it very nearly became open war until the soldiers on both sides simply refused to fight each other. The generals were forced into the Treaty of Brundisium, which redrew the line at the Adriatic, and it was sealed the way such things were sealed. Fulvia had died in Greece, so Antony married the young Caesar's sister Octavia, a woman of real dignity who spent the next decade trying to hold the two of them together. Virgil, writing that same year, produced a strange, short poem about a child about to be born who would end the Iron Age and bring back the Golden One. People have argued for 2,000 years about which baby he meant. What matters is that in 40 BC, educated Romans were prepared to believe that the world could be repaired. It was not repaired because Sicily was in enemy hands. Sextus Pompey, the surviving son of Pompey the Great, had gathered the wreckage of every losing side, filled his ships with escaped slaves and proscribed men, and made himself master of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. He called himself the son of Neptune and wore a sea blue cloak. He also sat directly across Rome's grain route. For 4 years, the city went hungry in a way it had not gone hungry in living memory. Bread prices went up several times over. There were riots. On one occasion, the young Caesar went into the forum to calm a crowd and was stoned, pinned against a wall, and only pulled out alive when Antony brought soldiers in through the side streets. A peace was patched up at Mycenum in 39 BC, over dinner on a flagship, where one of Sextus's captains is said to have offered to cut the anchor cable and kill all 3 triumvirs at sea, and was refused. The peace lasted about a year. The young Caesar was not a naval commander, and knew it. He had already lost 2 fleets, one to Sextus off Sicily and one to a storm off the Italian coast, and after the second disaster he had, by one account, looked at the wreckage on the beach and said that he would win this war, whether the gods liked it or not. So he handed the problem to Agrippa, and Agrippa solved it with engineering. In 37 BC, on the Bay of Naples, Agrippa took 2 lakes behind the coast, the Lucrine and Avernus, cut channels between them and out to the sea, and turned an inland sheet of water into a fortified naval base, where crews could be trained out of reach of enemy raiders. They called it Portus Julius. He built new heavier ships with towers, and he armed them with a device called the Harpax, a grapnel with a long shaft sheathed in iron so that it could not be cut with an axe, launched by catapult so that it could be thrown much further than a man could throw it. Sextus had faster ships and better sailors. Agrippa built a way to make speed irrelevant. On the 3rd of September, 36 BC, the 2 fleets met off Naulochus on the northern coast of Sicily, 300 ships on each side. In a stretch of water narrow enough that both armies watched from the shore, Sextus's crews expected to do what they had always done: run in fast, break oars, turn, and hit again from behind. It did not work. Every time a Sicilian ship closed, the catapults on Agrippa's decks threw the Harpax across. The iron shaft bit into the enemy's timbers, and the winch dragged the 2 hulls together until the legionaries could cross. Speed became a trap. The fighting turned into hundreds of separate boarding actions on a crowded sea, and the boarding actions favored the side with the heavier decks and the better armored infantry. By evening, Sextus's fleet had effectively ceased to exist. Appian reports that he escaped with 17 ships out of 300, while Agrippa lost 3. Sextus fled east and was killed the following year in Asia. Agrippa was given a crown of gold worked in the shape of ships' beaks, an award invented for him and never given to anyone else. The victory disposed of a 4th man as well. Lepidus had brought 14 legions from Africa to help, and after the battle he claimed Sicily for himself. The young Caesar walked into his camp almost unescorted and appealed directly to the soldiers over their commander's head, and the soldiers changed sides in front of Lepidus while he stood there. He was stripped of everything except the office of chief priest, held for life, which he kept for another 24 years. Living quietly at a seaside villa and occasionally summoned to Rome to be humiliated in the Senate, 2 men were left. While all this happened in the West, Antony was in the East, and his war went badly in a way that mattered more than any speech. In 36 BC, he invaded Parthia with something close to 100,000 men, taking the northern route through Armenia into Media rather than the desert road on which Crassus had been destroyed 17 years earlier. It was a sound plan. It failed on logistics. He raced ahead with the infantry and left the siege train, 300 wagons carrying the rams and towers he needed to break a walled city, strung out on the road behind him under an officer named Oppius Stadianus. Parthian cavalry found it, burned it, and killed the escort. Antony reached the city of Fraspa and had nothing to break it with. He besieged it anyway into the autumn, then had to retreat 300 kilometers through mountain country in early winter, with Parthian horse archers shadowing the column. Plutarch, a Greek priest at Delphi who knew descendants of men in that army, counted 18 engagements in 27 days and put the losses at around 24,000 men, most of them dead of cold, hunger, and thirst, rather than arrows. Antony survived it, and he made 2 decisions afterwards that his rival used to destroy him. In 34 BC, he took Armenia by treachery, arrested its king, and then celebrated the victory in Alexandria rather than Rome, riding into a Greek city with a captive king before an Egyptian crowd. Then, in the great gymnasium, he sat with Cleopatra VII on golden thrones, with their children on lower thrones beside them, and gave away provinces. Cleopatra was named Queen of Kings. Caesarion, her son, whom she had always claimed was fathered by Julius Caesar, was named King of Kings and declared Caesar's true son. Their own children were assigned Armenia, Media, Cyrenaica, Syria, and Cilicia, some of it Roman territory, some of it land nobody controlled. In Alexandria, this was ordinary Hellenistic royal theater. In Rome, read aloud in the Senate by a man who wanted him dead, it was a Roman consul handing the empire to a foreign queen and telling the world that a rival boy was the real heir of Caesar. The propaganda war of the early 30s BC was the most sophisticated ever conducted up to that point, and the young Caesar won it completely. He had coins, poets, veterans in every Italian town, and a simple story that any farmer could repeat, which was that Antony had been drugged out of his Roman senses by an Eastern woman and now took orders from her eunuchs. Antony's counterattacks were sharper than people remember. One surviving fragment of a letter has him asking, in soldier's language, why his rival should care where he puts himself of an evening, and reminding him of his own long list of women. It was funnier. It was also useless, because it was written from Alexandria. Then came the will. In 32 BC, with the Triumvirate's legal term expired and both consuls of the year siding with Antony, the young Caesar walked into the Senate house with armed men and sat between the consuls. And after that meeting, both consuls and something like 300 senators left Rome and went east to Antony. He responded by going to the Vestal Virgins, who kept the private wills of prominent Romans, and demanding Antony's. They refused. He took it anyway, read it himself, and then read the damaging parts to the Senate. It confirmed Caesarion as Caesar's son, left legacies to Antony's children by Cleopatra, and stated that Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria beside the queen even if he died in Rome. Whether it was genuine has been argued ever since. Seizing a living man's sealed will from the Vestals was a sacrilege so gross that inventing the contents afterwards would hardly have been a further step. But Italy believed it. A Roman who did not want to be buried in Italy had stopped being a Roman. What followed was the masterstroke. Instead of declaring civil war, he had every community in Italy and the western provinces swear a personal oath of loyalty to him by name, and then he declared war not on Antony but on Cleopatra, and did it by the oldest religious procedure available, a priest throwing a spear into a patch of ground before the temple of the war goddess to symbolize foreign soil. On paper, Rome was not fighting a Roman. Rome was fighting a foreign queen, and Antony was merely a Roman who happened to be standing in the way. His own account of his life, written half a century later, opens by saying that all Italy of its own free will swore allegiance to him and demanded him as its leader in the war. The oath was not entirely free, and he knew it. But it was the founding document of everything he built afterwards, because it made loyalty personal rather than constitutional. And that is what an emperor actually is. What really happened at the Battle of Actium? Less than most people think, and the reason is that the battle was lost before it was fought. In the spring of 31 BC, Antony brought his army and fleet across to western Greece and camped on the promontory at Actium, guarding the narrow entrance to the Ambracian Gulf, an inland sea with one door. It was a strong position. It became a trap because Agrippa did not attack it. Agrippa took his fleet south and started capturing the ports that fed it. He stormed Methone in the southwest Peloponnese, then took Corcyra, then Leucas, then Patrae, then Corinth, one harbor at a time, until the sea route from Egypt was cut and the grain ships stopped arriving. Meanwhile, the young Caesar landed north of the Gulf and dug in on high ground where Antony could not force him to fight. Through that summer, Antony's army sat in low, marshy ground beside standing water in the hottest months, and it did what armies did in such places. Malaria and dysentery went through the camp. Rowers died in such numbers that whole squadrons could not be manned, and Antony eventually burned a large part of his own fleet because there was nobody left to pull the oars. Officers began to leave. Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, an old republican who had fought at Philippi on the other side, and who was one of the most respected men in Antony's camp, took a small boat across to the enemy. Antony, in a gesture that tells you why men loved him, sent his baggage and his personal servants after him. Ahenobarbus died of fever within days. Amyntas, king of Galatia, rode over with 2,000 horsemen. By late August, the question was no longer how to win, but how to get out. Two plans were possible, and the argument between them explains everything that happened on the day. Canidius Crassus, who commanded the legions, wanted to burn the ships, march inland into Macedonia and Thrace, and fight a land campaign where Antony's 19 legions and his veteran reputation would count for something. Cleopatra wanted to break out by sea because her treasure was aboard the ships and because Egypt, not Greece, was the base that could rebuild an army. Antony chose the sea. And crucially, before the battle, he ordered the sails loaded aboard the warships. In an ancient sea fight, sails were left ashore, always, because masts and rigging were useless in a ramming action and dangerous in a boarding action. Carrying sails into battle means one thing. It means part of your fleet is planning to run before the wind and keep running. On the morning of the 2nd of September, 31 BC, Antony brought about 230 heavy ships out of the strait and formed line across the mouth in 3 squadrons. With Cleopatra's 60 Egyptian vessels behind the center, Agrippa faced him with something over 400 lighter, faster ships. For most of the morning, nothing happened. Both lines sat still, because Antony's ships were too big to attack with and too well armed to attack directly, and Agrippa was waiting for the northwesterly breeze that comes up on that coast in the early afternoon. Around midday, the wind arrived and the northern squadrons closed. What followed was less like a sea battle than like a series of small sieges. Agrippa's captains worked in groups of 3 and 4 around each of Antony's giants, throwing grapnels, shooting firepots and stones from deck catapults, backing off, coming in again. Antony's ships were floating towers with armored bows that could not be rammed and rails too high to board easily. They also could not catch anything. To get room, Agrippa kept extending his own left wing northward. Antony's right had to extend to match. The line stretched and it thinned, and somewhere in the middle of the afternoon a gap opened in the center. Cleopatra's squadron hoisted sail, went through it, and ran south with the wind. Antony left his flagship, transferred to a smaller and faster vessel, and followed with perhaps 40 ships. The rest of his fleet, hundreds of ships and thousands of men, was left in a fight it could not win and did not understand, and it kept fighting into the evening before surrendering. Plutarch puts the dead at about 5,000. The great abandoned warships were rowed into harbor as prizes. The moral collapse mattered more than the numbers. Canidius Crassus still had 19 legions in camp, undefeated and unbeaten, and for 7 days they waited for their commander to come back. He did not come back. So they surrendered, and their officers went over, and the largest army in the eastern Mediterranean changed hands without a battle because the man at the top had got into a small boat. Whether the flight was cowardice or the prearranged breakout going roughly as intended has been argued since antiquity. The loaded sails argue strongly for a plan. But a planned breakout that leaves 3/4 of your fleet and the whole of your army behind is not a plan that survives contact with what soldiers think of it. Antony reached Egypt with his treasure, and without his reputation, and in the ancient world those were the same asset. How did Antony and Cleopatra actually die? The end came the following summer, and it was slower and shabbier than the paintings suggest. Through the winter, Antony lived apart in a small house on a causeway in the harbor at Alexandria, and, according to Plutarch, called it his hermitage. Then rejoined the queen and her court for a last season of dinners by a society they renamed the Companions in death. Envoys went to the enemy. Cleopatra offered to abdicate in favor of her children. Antony offered to live as a private citizen in Athens. The answers were non-committal to her and silent to him because the young Caesar wanted the Egyptian treasury intact and wanted no negotiated exit for the man himself. On the 1st of August, 30 BC, his forces reached Alexandria. Antony's cavalry rode out and joined them. His remaining ships rowed out into the harbor, raised their oars in salute to the enemy, and went over. He went back into the palace, was told that Cleopatra was dead, and stabbed himself in the stomach. The report was false. He was still alive when servants hauled him up on ropes into the fortified building where she had shut herself in with her treasure, and he died there. Cleopatra outlived him by about 10 days, negotiating and being watched. She was 39, and she had been queen for 22 years, and she had understood earlier than anyone else in the East that Roman civil wars were the only real politics left. She was told, or worked out, that she was to be displayed in a triumph through Rome. On the 10th or 12th of August, she was found dead on a couch, dressed in full royal regalia, with 2 attendants dying beside her. The famous asp is a story Plutarch himself refused to vouch for. He wrote that nobody knew the truth, that some said a snake was smuggled in under figs, that some said she kept poison in a hollow hair comb, and that the only marks anyone found on her body were 2 faint punctures on the arm. A snake capable of killing 3 women in a closed room and then vanishing is a poor fit for the evidence. Poison prepared in advance is a much better one. She was buried beside Antony, which is the one thing in the entire war that both sides seem to have agreed on. Then the killing that mattered politically. Caesarion, 17 years old, was sent south towards the Red Sea with a tutor and persuaded to turn back on a promise of safety, and was executed. A philosopher in the victor's circle is reported to have made the remark that too many Caesars is not a good thing. Antyllus, Antony's eldest son by Fulvia, was dragged from a shrine and killed. The 3 younger children of Antony and Cleopatra were spared, walked in the triumph as children, and handed to Octavia, Antony's Roman wife and the victor's sister, who raised them with her own. One of them, Cleopatra Selene, later became Queen of Mauritania in North Africa and lived a long life. That is what mercy looked like in this world. It was extended precisely as far as it was safe, and not one step further. Egypt did not become a province like the others. It became the personal possession of the man who had taken it, governed by a knight appointed by him, with no senator permitted to set foot in it without written permission. That was not vanity. Egypt was the granary and the treasury, and no rival was ever going to be allowed to stand where Cleopatra had stood, and the treasure came home. So much bullion arrived in Rome in 29 BC that the standard rate of interest fell from 12% to 4%, and land prices jumped, which is one of the very few moments in ancient history where we can watch a whole economy react to a single event. Every soldier was paid. Every veteran got land, bought this time rather than confiscated. The gates of the Temple of Janus, which stood open whenever Rome was at war anywhere, were closed for the first time in over 200 years. How did Augustus end the Roman Republic without anyone stopping him? The answer is that he never ended it. He announced its restoration, repeatedly, in public, with paperwork, and made himself the person restoration ran through. On the 13th of January 27 BC, he came before the Senate and gave everything back. He resigned his emergency powers and returned the provinces and the armies to the Senate and people of Rome. It was a genuinely astonishing performance, and it was also entirely safe, because the Senate was full of men he had appointed, because the legions had sworn to him personally, and because he had already made sure everyone knew what the alternative to him looked like. The Senate begged him to reconsider. 3 days later, a compromise was reached. He would take charge, for 10 years only, of the provinces that were unsettled and needed troops, and the Senate would govern the peaceful ones. The provinces he took were Spain, Gaul, Syria, Cyprus, and Egypt. Those provinces contained almost every legion in the Roman army. The same week they gave him a name. A senator proposed Romulus, which was rejected because Romulus had been a king and had also, in one version, been murdered by senators. Instead, they settled on Augustus, a word from the language of religion meaning consecrated or blessed by favorable omen, a word previously applied to places and rights rather than people. Oak leaves, the crown given for saving a citizen's life in battle, were fixed over his door. Laurel trees were planted on either side of it. A golden shield was set up in the Senate House listing 4 qualities the state was thanking him for, which were courage, mercy, justice, and duty to gods and country. None of these things was an office. All of them were permanent. 4 years later, he nearly died, and the near death produced the machinery that actually mattered. In 23 BC, he fell so ill that he handed his signet ring to Agrippa and his state accounts to a consul, and everybody expected the end. He recovered, and then made changes that look modest and are not. He gave up the consulship, which he had held every single year, because holding it blocked one of the 2 top jobs that ambitious senators needed. In exchange, he took 2 things. First, the power of a tribune of the people, for life, which gave him the right to propose or veto any law, to convene the Senate, and to be personally sacrosanct, meaning that laying a hand on him was a religious crime. Second, a form of command authority that outranked the governor of any province, including provinces he did not govern. He now had no permanent office at all, and complete control of law and army. From that year onward, he dated his own reign by counting the years of his tribunician power, and so did every emperor after him. He described the arrangement himself. In the account of his life, he had carved on bronze at the end of it, with a precision worth noticing. He said that he stood above all other men in authority, but that he held no more legal power than any colleague in any magistracy he shared. The Latin word he used for that first quality carries the sense of weight, standing, the thing that makes people do what you suggest without a law compelling them. It has no legal definition. And that is the whole system. Not a throne, not a crown, not a title with defined powers, but a man whose recommendations nobody could afford to decline, holding a bundle of ordinary republican powers that had never been bundled before. He preferred to be called princeps, first citizen, a word Republican Rome had used for its leading senators. Historians call the system he built the Principate. Almost every Roman in 23 BC would have told you, quite sincerely, that they lived in a republic. The army was the other half of the settlement, and here he was ruthlessly practical. After Actium, there were 60 legions in existence, and the Roman world could not afford them and could not survive them. He discharged more than half. Something like 100,000 veterans were settled in colonies from Spain to Pisidia, paid off in cash, and land bought at market rates, and the receipts are in his own account of it. He kept 28 legions and made service a career instead of a levy. 16 years and then 20 years with the standards, followed by discharge with a bonus equal to about 13 years of pay. And in 6 AD, he founded a separate military treasury to fund those discharge payments, seeded it with 170 million sesterces of his own money, and then funded it permanently with a tax on auction sales and a 5% duty on inheritances, which the wealthy hated. Every soldier now took an oath to the emperor, was paid by the emperor, and retired on the emperor's pension. No senator would ever again raise an army out of his own clients. That, more than any constitutional wording, is why nobody stopped him. He also made the city itself safe in a way it never had been. Rome had no police and no fire service. He created 9 cohorts of praetorians as a standing guard, paid at triple rates, but kept only 3 of them in the city at a time, and the rest scattered around Italy so that the sight of an armed camp would not frighten anyone. He created 3 urban cohorts under the city prefect for public order, and in 6 AD, after a series of terrible fires, 7 cohorts of night watchmen recruited from freed slaves, each with its own station. Water buckets, axes, hooked poles for pulling burning roofs apart, and a rotating patrol. He divided the city into 14 administrative regions and 265 neighborhoods, and at the crossroads shrine of every neighborhood, the local officers, mostly freedmen, tended a cult that honored the household spirits of Augustus. A man who had never seen the emperor in his life poured a libation to the emperor's guardian spirit at the end of his own street. While the Constitution was being quietly rebuilt, the map kept moving, and it is worth watching, because the reign that is remembered for peace conquered more territory than any Roman before it. In the northwest, the Cantabrian and Asturian tribes of the mountains along the Bay of Biscay had held out against Rome for 2 centuries. From 26 BC, Augustus went in person, then fell ill, then handed the war to Agrippa, who finished it in 19 BC, with tactics that were closer to extermination than conquest, moving whole populations down out of the hills into new towns on the plain where they could be watched. After 200 years, the Iberian Peninsula was finally completely Roman, and its gold and silver mines went to work on a scale that shows up as a spike of lead pollution in ice cores drilled in Greenland. In the center, the Alps were cleared. In 15 BC, his 2 stepsons, Tiberius and the younger and more popular Drusus, converged on the Alpine tribes from Gaul and from Italy in a single summer campaign and broke them. A monument raised on a headland above the coast at La Tourbe, near modern Monaco, still stands with the names of 45 conquered peoples cut into it. That opened the road north, and over the next 15 years, Roman armies pushed the frontier from the foothills to the Danube, absorbing what became Rhaetia, Noricum, and Pannonia. In the east, there was no war at all, and it was presented as the greatest triumph of the reign. In 20 BC, by negotiation backed with troop movements in Armenia, the Parthian king returned the legionary standards captured from Crassus at Carrhae 33 years earlier, along with surviving prisoners. Rome went, in the phrase used at the time, from mourning to celebration. A temple was voted to house the eagles. Coins across the empire showed a kneeling Parthian handing over a standard. A famous marble statue found at Prima Porta shows the emperor in armor with that exact scene on his breastplate. He had recovered the honor of Rome without fighting a battle, which he understood was better than fighting one. And then Germany, which is where the ambition ran out. From 12 BC, Drusus took Roman armies across the Rhine and campaigned for 4 seasons in country no Roman army had ever operated in, cutting a canal to move ships from the Rhine into the North Sea, reaching the Weser, and in 9 BC, reaching the Elbe itself, 500 kilometers east of the Rhine. On the way back from that river, he fell from his horse and died of the injury a month later, at 29. And his brother Tiberius rode a reported extraordinary distance in a few days to reach him before the end, and then walked in front of the coffin the whole way back to Rome in winter. Tiberius took over the war. By about 4 AD, the tribes between the Rhine and the Elbe had submitted, and a new province was being organized. Roman merchants were operating there. Chief sons were being educated as Romans. On the map, Germania looked finished. What was life actually like under the Roman peace? Not in the palace, on the ground. For a man who owned 2 tunics. Start with what was on his table, because the archaeology is unusually clear. From about 30 BC, the potteries around Arretium in Tuscany began mass-producing a glossy bright red tableware, molded, stamped with the maker's name, in standard shapes, in enormous volume. It was good enough to look like the metal service of a rich man, and cheap enough that a tenant farmer could own a set. Pieces stamped by Aretine workshops have been dug up in Roman forts on the Rhine, in Britain before the conquest, in the Sudan, and at Arakamedu on the southeast coast of India. That is what an integrated economy looks like from underneath. The same is true of wine and oil, which traveled in pottery amphorae stamped at their point of origin, so that a bar in Gaul can be shown to have been serving wine from Campania and oil from southern Spain. The sea traffic that carried it is measurable, because ships sank. The Mediterranean seabed holds more datable Roman wrecks from the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD than from any other period before the Age of Steam, and the cargoes get bigger. One vessel found off southern France was carrying something close to 10,000 amphorae. The geographer Strabo, who traveled widely and wrote in the emperor's own lifetime, recorded that in his day about 120 ships a year sailed from the Egyptian Red Sea port of Myos Hormos for India, where before Roman control of Egypt, the number had been closer to 20. Roman silver coins of exactly this period turn up in hordes in southern India in the thousands. A merchant in Alexandria could now insure, finance, and dispatch a voyage to the Malabar coast and expect the pepper to come back. In the city, life got measurably less lethal and no less crowded. Rome held perhaps 1 million people, most of them in apartment blocks of shops on the ground floor and rooms above, built cheaply, burning regularly, and collapsing often enough that Augustus set a legal height limit of 70 Roman feet on any building fronting a public street. Water came in on 9 aqueducts, and Agrippa, in a year when he took the junior office of aedile at a rank far below his dignity, overhauled the whole system, cleaned out the great sewer, built a new aqueduct, opened 170 free bathhouses, and gave out free olive oil and salt to the city for a year. He also, at his own expense, gave the city its first great public baths and left them free to enter in his will. A man with no money could be clean, in warm water, under a vaulted ceiling, in a building with a library attached. 250,000 adult male citizens were on the grain list, which entitled them to a monthly ration collected at a public portico with a ticket. Egypt alone sent something like 20 million measures of wheat a year, roughly a third of what the city consumed, arriving on a fleet whose timing was watched the way modern cities watch a harvest report. An ordinary legionary earned 900 sesterces a year, and a measure of wheat, enough bread for a man for most of a month, cost a few sesterces in a normal year. The gap between those two numbers is the whole social history of the period. A poor free family lived close to the line, and one bad grain season or one illness put them over it. Look at the tombstones and you see something new. Along the roads out of every Italian city, in exactly these decades, freed slaves began putting up carved portrait reliefs of themselves, in citizen dress, husband and wife facing forward and clasping right hands in the gesture of a legal Roman marriage, with their names and the letter that marked them as freed. These are people who had been property, who bought or were given their liberty, made money in trade, and spent it on a permanent public statement that they were now inside the community. There were so many of them that Augustus passed 2 laws restricting how many slaves an owner could free at once and at what age, which tells you the scale of the traffic in both directions. The same peace that let a freedman buy a marble portrait was fed by a slave trade running out of the frontier wars, and Roman writers of the period saw no contradiction there at all, which is a useful corrective to any warm feeling about the age. And then, the coins, which everybody handled every day. He reformed the money into a single system that held for 2 centuries, gold and silver from imperial mints, small change in brass and copper, at fixed relationships, with his own head on the silver and the gold. A soldier on the Rhine and a shopkeeper in Antioch now carried the same coin with the same face. Milestones on the roads counted the distance from the golden column in the Forum. A courier system with staged horses ran official mail along those roads at speed. Local calendars in the Greek East were rewritten so that the year began on the emperor's birthday. And a decree from the province of Asia survives in stone, announcing that this man's birth was the beginning of good news for the world. That is not a metaphor invented by later writers. It is an inscription put up by provincial officials who wanted to be noticed, and it tells you how the piece was sold and, in many places, how it was received. The man himself lived, by the standards of his class, plainly, and the details come from Suetonius, who worked as an imperial secretary with access to the archives a century later, and who was a collector of exactly this kind of thing. He slept in the same modest bedroom on the Palatine for 40 years. His house had no marble floors and no elaborate rooms, and visitors who expected a palace were surprised. He wore clothes woven at home by his wife, his sister, and his granddaughters as a piece of deliberate old-fashioned theater. He ate coarse bread, small fish, fresh cheese and green figs, often standing, often at odd hours. He was a nervous man in thunderstorms and carried a piece of sealskin as a charm against lightning. He was also the man who had signed the proscription lists. Both things are true, and neither cancels the other. What happened to the 3 legions lost in the Teutoburg forest? That question ends the expansion of the Roman Empire, and it starts with a man Rome had made itself. Arminius was a nobleman of the Cherusci, a tribe on the Weser. He had been sent to Rome as a hostage or an ally's son, learned Latin, commanded Cherusci cavalry and Roman service in the Balkans, and been rewarded with Roman citizenship and admission to the equestrian order. In 9 AD, he was about 25, trusted and attached to the staff of the governor of Germania, Publius Quinctilius Varus. Varus was 53, from a noble family, married into the imperial house, and had governed Africa and Syria. Velleius Paterculus, an officer who served in Germany and knew both men personally, wrote that Varus was a mild man who arrived in a rich province poor and left a poor province rich. He was a competent administrator of settled places who had been given a country that was not settled, and he behaved as if it were, holding courts, hearing lawsuits, and levying taxes among people who had submitted 3 years earlier at spear point. In the late summer of 9 AD, the Roman army of the Rhine was where it always was in summer, in a marching camp far to the east, near the Weser. Varus had 3 legions, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th, along with 6 auxiliary cohorts and 3 cavalry squadrons, something in the region of 15 to 20,000 fighting men. He also had the enormous civilian tail of a Roman army in a pacified province, wagons, servants, traders, women, and children. He was preparing the march back to the winter quarters on the Rhine, when word came of a rising among a tribe to the northwest. The route to deal with it was a detour off the good road into broken country. The man who confirmed the report and offered to guide him was Arminius. Another Cheruscan noble, Sextus, who had a private feud with Arminius over a daughter, told Varus at dinner that he was being betrayed and asked to have Arminius and the other chiefs arrested at the table. Varus refused. He had known Arminius for years. The column moved out into forest and heath and bog, and it rained. Cassius Dio, a Roman senator and consul writing 2 centuries later from earlier accounts, describes a storm that went on for days, trees coming down, wagons bogging to the axles, and a column strung out over a length that would have been something like 15 or 20 kilometers. Arminius and the auxiliary chiefs asked leave to ride ahead and bring up local levies, and were given it. Then the attacks began, at first from a distance, javelins thrown out of the trees at the baggage and the flanks, no line to fight, no enemy to close with. The first night they built a proper camp, burned wagons and surplus baggage in the morning, and marched on in tighter order. It was better in open country. Then the ground closed in again. The place where it ended has almost certainly been found. In 1987, a British Army officer and amateur archaeologist named Tony Clun, working with a metal detector and permission from the local museum, began pulling Roman coins and sling bullets out of the fields at Calcrease, north of Osnabrück. What excavation revealed there is a bottleneck. A steep wooded hill on one side, an enormous bog on the other, and between them a strip of firm sandy ground only a few hundred meters wide, with a track running through it. Along the base of the hill, someone had built a wall of stacked turf, over half a kilometer of it, with drainage behind and gaps to move through, not a fortification of a settlement. An ambush position, prepared in advance, on the only road a column could take. Imagine the last hour from the line. You have been marching in rain for 3 days in a soaked woolen cloak. Your shield's leather cover is waterlogged, and the laminated wood is coming apart. The bow of the column is somewhere ahead, out of sight, the tail somewhere behind, and there is no formation possible because the track is wide enough for 4 men. To your right, up the slope, there is a wall you cannot see over, and men are throwing spears over it and then stepping back. To your left is water. Officers try to form a line facing the hill, and the men are pushed off the firm ground into the bog. The cavalry commander, Numonius Valla, decides that the infantry cannot be saved, takes the horse, and rides for the Rhine, and is caught and killed in open country. Varus, wounded, does what a Roman commander of his class did in this situation and falls on his sword, and several of his senior officers do the same. Some units fight on into the following day. The three eagles are lost. The finds at Calcrease are what makes it unbearable, rather than merely historical. A cavalry parade mask of iron faced with silver, lying in the ground where it fell off a helmet. A mule's bell with the clapper packed with grass so the animal would move silently, which means somebody in that column knew they were being hunted and tried. Coins, none of them minted later than the campaign. Bones of men and horses, some in pits, showing signs of having lain exposed on the surface for years before burial, which fits precisely with what Tacitus wrote about a Roman army under Germanicus reaching the site 6 years later and burying whitening bones, finding skulls fixed to tree trunks, and finding the pits where the tribunes and centurions had been sacrificed. Officers were killed at altars. That is not Roman rhetoric. It matches the archaeology of ritual deposition in Northern Europe. In Rome, the news arrived as pure disaster, and the reaction of the emperor is one of the very few glimpses we get of him with his composure gone. Suetonius, writing a century later with the archives open to him, says he let his hair and beard grow for months, that he sometimes struck his head against a door and called out for Quintilius Varus to give him back his legions, and that he kept the day as an annual day of mourning for the rest of his life. He dismissed his German bodyguard from the city. He put troops on the streets against panic. He was 71 years old, and there were no reserves. Every legion in the empire was already committed, and a huge revolt in Illyricum had only just been put down after 3 years and 15 legions. Germany east of the Rhine was abandoned. The numbers of the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions were never used again by the Roman army, which had no formal rule requiring that, and did it anyway. The strategic consequence outlived everyone involved. Rome kept the Rhine as its border, and the line between Roman and non-Roman Europe hardened along that river and the Danube, and stayed there, with brief exceptions, for 400 years. The advice Augustus left in the documents opened after his death, according to Tacitus, was that the empire should be kept within its present boundaries. Whether that was strategic wisdom or an old man's exhaustion after losing 3 legions and, before that, 2 grandsons, is exactly the kind of thing historians argue about. Because the succession had been failing for 20 years, and it is the part of the reign he handled worst. He had 1 child, his daughter Julia, and he spent his life moving her from husband to manufacture an heir. First, her cousin Marcellus, who died at 19 in 23 BC. Then Agrippa, the friend who had won all his battles, 25 years her senior, who gave him grandsons and then died suddenly in 12 BC. Then Tiberius, his stepson, who was ordered to divorce a wife he loved in order to marry her, and who was so unhappy that in 6 BC he simply left public life and went to the island of Rhodes for 7 years. Julia herself, brilliant and witty by every account, was accused of a string of adulteries in 2 BC and exiled by her own father to a tiny island off the Italian coast under a law against adultery that he had written himself. He never saw her again. The grandsons he had adopted and groomed, Gaius and Lucius, died within 18 months of each other, one of illness at Marseille in 2 AD, one of a wound in Armenia in 4 AD, aged 19 and 23. That left Tiberius, recalled from Rhodes, adopted in 4 AD at the age of 45, a man of proven military ability whom Augustus had passed over twice and did not much like. He was made to adopt his nephew Germanicus at the same time, so the line would run back into the blood family. The last surviving grandson, Agrippa Postumus, was disinherited and exiled to a guarded island in 7 AD. When the old man finally died at Nola, on the 19th of August, 14 AD, in the same room in which his father had died 72 years earlier. Suetonius reports that he asked whether he had played his part well in the comedy of life, and then, in the way an actor asks a Roman audience at the end of a play, asked them to applaud as he went off. Then he died in the arms of his wife Livia, and there were people in Rome who whispered that she had helped him along with poisoned figs, a story repeated by Cassius Dio and hinted at by Tacitus and believed by essentially no serious historian today. His body was carried by night by the town councilors of each district and lay in state at Rome. He had written his own funeral inscription in advance. It was cut on 2 bronze pillars at the entrance to his tomb, copied on temple walls across the eastern provinces, and the best surviving copy is carved on a temple in what is now Ankara, in Turkey, in Latin, with a Greek translation. In it he lists what he did, what he built, what he paid for, how many citizens he settled, how many gladiators fought in his games, how many temples he restored. He restored 82 of them in a single year. On the 17th of September, the Senate voted him a god, with a temple and a priesthood, and a senator named Numerius Atticus swore on oath that he had seen the emperor's shape rising to heaven, for which Livia is said to have paid him 1,000,000 sesterces. Both parts of that story are equally revealing. So was Augustus a good emperor or a tyrant? And here the honest answer is that historians have been arguing about it since the year he died, and are not close to agreement. Take the serious positions one at a time. The first argument is about whether the Republic was murdered or was already dead. One school, associated above all with the historian Ronald Syme, whose book on the Roman Revolution came out in 1939 and was written with the dictatorships of his own decade in view, sees a straightforward seizure of power. A ruthless faction leader used a name, an army, and a propaganda machine to install himself and his friends, and the constitutional language was a screen. The competing case, argued by scholars such as Eric Gruen, is that the Republic was functioning reasonably well until very late, that its collapse was not inevitable, and that what killed it was a specific sequence of accidents and armed men rather than deep structural rot. A third position says the crucial break came a generation earlier, when Marius and then Sulla showed that a Roman army would follow its general against the state, and everything after that was timing. The second argument is about intent. Did he plan a monarchy from the beginning, or did he improvise for 50 years and only look coherent afterwards? The case for planning is the sheer consistency of it. The way each settlement in 27 and 23 and 19 BC added a permanent power while appearing to give one back. The case for improvisation is the long list of things he clearly did not plan, the succession above all, and the 23 BC illness, which forced a rearrangement nobody had prepared. Our two most vivid ancient witnesses give opposite readings, and both are compromised. Velleius Paterculus, an officer who served under Tiberius and wrote while Tiberius was on the throne, describes the settlement as the return of law and order to a shattered world. Tacitus, a senator writing a century later under emperors he despised, opens his account by saying that the young man used bribes to seduce the soldiers, cheap grain to seduce the people, and the sweetness of peace to seduce everyone else, and then took everything while the old order died out, and nobody living remembered anything different. Neither man is neutral. Both are describing things they knew. The third argument is about whether the peace was real. Inside the frontier, it substantially was. Italy went from 4 decades of civil war to a century without one, and the economic evidence, the wrecks, the pottery, the coin hoards, the ice cores, all point the same way. But the closing of the gates of Janus, which he did 3 times in a reign of 44 years, meant that no Roman legion was fighting anywhere on earth on those particular days, and those days were rare. Spain, the Alps, Pannonia, Illyricum, and Germany were conquered or crushed during the peace. And the Cantabrian and Illyrian campaigns involved deportations and enslavement on a scale that would look very different if we had a single surviving account written by the losers. The Roman peace was a peace at the center paid for by permanent war at the edge. Both halves of that sentence are true, and any account that drops one of them is propaganda. The fourth argument is about Livia and the deaths. Marcellus, Agrippa, Gaius, Lucius, and finally Augustus himself all died in a sequence that ended with Livia's son on the throne, and ancient writers noticed. Tacitus hints, Dio repeats. The counter-argument is straightforward demography. In a world without antibiotics, where the wealthy died of fevers as reliably as the poor, and where 2 of the deaths occurred hundreds of kilometers away on campaign, a run of deaths in one family over 30 years requires no poison at all. There is no evidence beyond rumor, and the rumors are all recorded by writers with reasons to blacken the reputations of the women of the imperial house. It remains one of history's great unfalsifiable stories, which is precisely why it will not die. The fifth argument is about the record itself, because our best source on Augustus is Augustus. The account carved on those bronze pillars is a masterpiece of selective truth. Every number in it appears to be accurate. What it leaves out is the shape of the thing. The proscriptions are absent. Antony is barely named and is described only as a faction. The civil wars appear as the pacification of the world. He writes that he freed the state from the domination of a faction, and that after that he handed all power back to the Senate and people, and both statements are, in the narrow legal sense, defensible. Reading it is the closest we come to hearing him talk, and the voice is calm, precise, generous, and entirely in control of what you are allowed to know. Here is what seems to me the most important thing, and it is not a verdict. The people who lived through this did not know it was happening. There was no moment when the Roman Republic was abolished. Nobody voted it out of existence. Every single step was a temporary measure justified by an emergency that was completely real. The Triumvirate was for 5 years and was renewed. The provinces were taken for 10 years and were renewed again and again and again for the rest of his life, and then for the lives of his successors. The powers he held were ordinary republican powers held by an extraordinary person. The Senate still met. The consuls were still elected and still gave their names to the year. The old families still competed for office and still won it. A man walking into the Forum in 10 AD saw the same buildings, the same magistrates, the same procedures his grandfather had seen, and would have been baffled by the suggestion that he lived under a monarchy. And that is the mechanism. It did not take a coup. It took an ordinary human lifespan. He ruled for 57 years, counting from the day he claimed his inheritance, which meant that when he died, a Roman of 60 had been a boy of 3 when Caesar was murdered, and had never in adult life made a political decision that was not shaped by this one man. Tacitus put it exactly. By the end, he wrote, very few were left who had ever seen the Republic. The men who might have objected had died of old age, one at a time, over half a century, and their sons had grown up understanding that the way to succeed was to be useful to the household on the Palatine. The Republic did not fall. It was outlived. Which leaves the one question that everyone in Rome was asking on the 19th of August, 14 AD, and that nobody could answer. What he had built was not an office. There was no law that made anyone emperor, because there was no such thing as an emperor. There was only a specific man holding a bundle of powers that the Senate had voted him personally, backed by an authority that could not be written down, and by definition, could not be inherited. The system had never been tested, because there had only ever been one of him. Now, a 55-year-old soldier named Tiberius, twice passed over, forced into a marriage he hated, exiled to a Greek island for 7 years, and recalled only when everyone else was dead, had to walk into the Senate House and find out whether the thing worked without its inventor. Within days, on the guarded island where he had been confined, the last surviving grandson of Augustus was cut down by a centurion, and no one has ever established who gave the order. The first crime of the new reign happened before the funeral. That is the story we will tell next. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this one. If you got something out of it, hit that like button and subscribe, because long-form history only survives on this platform if people actually finish it, and you just did. Now settle an argument for us in the comments. When Cleopatra's 60 ships hoisted sail at Actium and ran for open water, what were you watching? Was it a betrayal? And Antony lost his fleet because a queen panicked? Was it the plan working? A breakout executed exactly as agreed, and the disgrace is only in how it looked? Or was it Antony's failure alone, a commander who chose the wrong battle, loaded his sails before a fight, and then followed her because he had already decided that the war was lost? Pick one and defend it, and we will read the best arguments. We will see you in the next video.